My name is Henry Rogers, but everyone knows me as Hank. At 97, the memories of those freezing days in Bastogne still haunt me with disturbing clarity. Every detail remains vivid in my mind, as if it had happened yesterday. It was December 1944, and I was a sergeant in the 101st Airborne Division, the Screaming Eagles. The deafening sound of German artillery explosions still echoes in my ears when I close my eyes. We were surrounded, isolated, and the harshest winter in decades was punishing our bodies and spirits. But let me tell you from the beginning, from that fateful morning when everything changed. That day, I was with my platoon on the front line. Corporal Martinez, my radio man, came running with alarming news. "Sergeant, the Germans have broken through the lines in several positions. It's a full-scale offensive." The information dropped like a bomb. In a matter of hours, we found ourselves completely surrounded in the Belgian town of Bastogne. Lieutenant Wilson, our platoon commander, called the sergeants together for an urgent briefing. "Gentlemen, the situation is critical. The Germans have superior numbers and equipment. Our mission is to defend Bastogne at all costs. It's a vital strategic point. If it falls, the entire Allied line could collapse." I remember looking at the faces of my men. Some were practically boys, like Private O'Brien, who had just turned 19. Others were seasoned veterans like Sergeant Rodriguez, who had been with me since Normandy. They all shared the same expression of determination mixed with apprehension. Our position was in a dense wood on the outskirts of the city. We dug deep foxholes in the frozen earth, our hands bleeding from the effort. The cold was our first enemy, temperatures well below zero, without proper winter gear. Many men developed trench foot, a painful condition caused by freezing. The first waves of German attack came at dawn, Panzer tanks advancing under cover of their infantry. Martinez was at my side when the first shell exploded near our position. "Hold your position," I shouted as our M1 Garand rifles and .30 machine guns spat fire at the enemy. Corporal Stevens, our bar sniper, methodically suppressed the Germans who tried to approach. He was a quiet man from Minnesota, but his aim was lethal. "Ammunition is getting critical, Sarge," he warned me after repelling yet another attack. The shortage of supplies was desperate. We rationed everything: food, ammunition, medicines. Our doctor, Doc Miller, worked miracles with the few resources available. I saw him work tirelessly, saving lives under enemy fire, even using makeshift bandages made from parachutes. One particularly difficult night, I shared my last cigarette with Rodriguez. "You know, Hank," he said, looking at the enemy lines, "I never thought I'd be fighting on Christmas." Black humor was our escape valve. We had to keep morale high, even when all seemed lost. German pressure was constant. Artillery, infantry attacks, night infiltration attempts. We lost good men. Every casualty was like losing a brother. Young O'Brien was hit defending our position during a particularly intense attack. His last words were about his mother in Chicago. But we stood firm. When the Germans demanded our surrender, our general responded with a single word: "Nuts." That answer spread through the line like wildfire, boosting the morale of the troops. It was the embodiment of our determination. One of the most critical moments came when we identified a concentration of enemy forces preparing for a major assault. With our ammunition almost depleted and no air support due to the weather, I had to make a risky decision. I organized a group of volunteers for a night counterattack. Martinez, Stevens, Rodriguez, and 5 other men volunteered. We moved silently through the snow, using the darkness as cover. The plan was simple but audacious: attack the enemy's flank, create confusion, and make it look like we were outnumbered. The operation was a success, but it was costly. We lost Stevens that night. He sacrificed himself to cover our retreat. His sacrifice was not in vain. The planned German attack never materialized, and we gained precious time until General Patton's reinforcements arrived. Those days in Bastogne changed us forever. We learned the true meaning of brotherhood, sacrifice, and resistance. Every man who fought there carried with him not only the physical scars, but also the indelible memories of courage and determination in the face of the impossible. Even now, so many decades later, I can still see the faces of my comrades, hear their voices, feel the weight of those moments. Bastogne wasn't just a battle, it was a test of the human spirit, proof that even in the most adverse circumstances, courage and unity can prevail. As the days dragged on in Bastogne, every hour seemed like an eternity. The night that struck me the most was when we carried out a patrol mission to assess the enemy positions. Rodriguez, Martinez, and I led a small group through the freezing darkness, our footsteps muffled by the deep snow. The silence was disturbing, interrupted only by the occasional distant whistle of artillery shells. As we moved between the snow-covered trees, we found disturbing evidence of the enemy's strength. Traces of armored vehicles, abandoned artillery positions, and signs of large-scale troop movements. "Sarge, you need to see this," whispered Martinez, pointing to a clearing ahead. Through the mist, we saw a column of Panzer tanks camouflaged under nets and branches. There were at least a dozen of them, all prepared for an imminent attack. That same night, we returned to our lines with vital information, but the cost was high. During our retreat, a German patrol group spotted us. The ensuing firefight was brief, but intense. Rodriguez was shot in the shoulder, and I had to carry him for almost a kilometer across the snowy terrain. Doc Miller worked tirelessly to stabilize Rodriguez. "He'll survive," said the doctor, "but we need to evacuate him as soon as possible." Unfortunately, with the German siege, medical evacuations were practically impossible. Our situation became more desperate by the day. Rationing became more severe. We shared a single K ration between 3 men. The cold was relentless, penetrating to our bones. Many soldiers improvised protection against the cold using old newspapers inside their clothes. One morning, Lieutenant Wilson called me in for an emergency meeting. "Hank, our ammunition supplies are critically low. We need to organize a mission to recover ammunition from an abandoned depot 2 kilometers from here." It was a suicide mission, but we had no choice. I gathered a group of volunteers, including young Private Anderson, a kid from Kansas who had barely turned 20. His determination reminded me of O'Brien, whom we had lost a few days earlier. We set off at dusk, taking advantage of the cover of darkness. The depot was on an abandoned farm, surrounded by German positions. We approached by crawling through the snow, each movement calculated to avoid detection. The interior of the depot was a maze of abandoned boxes and equipment. We found several boxes of .30 ammunition, hand grenades, and even some medical supplies. It was like finding treasure in the middle of hell. The way back was even more tense. Each man was carrying extra weight, making our movements slower and more difficult. About halfway along our lines, German flares turned night into day. We stood motionless, practically buried in the snow, while enemy patrols passed within meters of our position. Anderson proved his worth that night. When one of the men slipped, almost knocking over a box of ammunition, he reacted instantly, preventing the noise from giving us away. His young face showed the same determination I saw in so many others who had grown up too quickly in that war. Back at our lines, we distributed the supplies. The ammunition we had brought would be vital in the following days, when the Germans launched a series of coordinated attacks. Every bullet counted, every grenade was precious. One of the most surreal memories of that period was Christmas Eve. In the midst of the siege, some German soldiers began to sing Still Nacht, Silent Night. Gradually, voices from our side joined in. For a few moments, the war seemed to pause, reminding us all of our shared humanity. But the unofficial truce was short-lived. The next morning, the German artillery resumed its bombardment in full force. That was the day we lost Anderson. He was hoping to reinforce a position when a shell directly hit his foxhole. His courage and sacrifice will never be forgotten. As December progressed, our situation became more and more critical. The cold was taking its toll. Cases of frostbite were multiplying, and our medical supplies were insufficient. But one thing kept our spirits up: the promise that Patton was on his way. Every man in Bastogne knew that we were part of something bigger than ourselves. It wasn't just a battle, it was a turning point in the war. Our resistance was preventing the Germans from achieving their strategic objectives, and every day we endured was a victory in itself. Between the endless nights of surveillance and the days of constant combat, we formed bonds that transcended the normal camaraderie between soldiers. We were more than a unit, we were a family forged in the ice and fire of Bastogne. The arrival of General Patton and his troops was like a ray of hope cutting through the darkness that surrounded us in Bastogne. But before that, we faced some of the most challenging moments of the entire war. What I'm about to tell you now still makes me shiver, even after so many decades. One particularly frosty morning, I was ordered to lead a reconnaissance mission with Martinez and 3 other men. We needed to assess the concentration of German forces in the eastern sector. Private Parker, a rookie from Idaho who had joined us after the initial casualties, showed palpable nervousness. "Stay close, kid," I whispered to Parker as we moved across the snow-covered terrain. Our breathing formed little clouds in the freezing air. Martinez, ever attentive, followed ahead, his experienced eyes scanning every suspicious shadow. That's when we came across something that would change the course of our resistance. In the middle of a small clearing, we discovered a partially destroyed German supply depot. Among the rubble were documents that revealed crucial details about enemy plans for a massive attack on Bastogne. "Sarge, you need to see this," Martinez called out, holding up some papers. They were detailed maps and orders written in German. Even without understanding the language, the markings on the maps were clear enough. The Germans were planning a coordinated attack with 3 panzer divisions. Our return was interrupted by a German patrol. We split up to avoid detection, but Parker, in his nervousness, tripped and fell. The noise attracted enemy attention. In a matter of seconds, we were under heavy fire. "Cover the right flank," I shouted as we sought cover behind fallen trees. Martinez managed to take out 2 German soldiers who were trying to flank us. Parker, despite his initial fear, stood his ground, providing accurate covering fire with his M1 Garand. During the firefight, we realized that we were being surrounded. I had to make a quick decision. "Martinez, take the documents back. Parker and I will create a distraction." It was risky, but that information needed to reach command. Parker and I moved in the opposite direction, drawing enemy fire. We used hand grenades to simulate a larger attack, confusing the Germans about our real numbers. The trick worked, giving Martinez and the others enough time to escape with the documents. We spent the next 6 hours dodging German patrols, using every survival technique we knew. Parker proved his worth that day, keeping his cool even in the most tense situations. When we finally made it back to our lines, we learned that the documents had reached command. The information we recovered was invaluable. The command was able to reorganize our defenses based on the captured German plans. When the attack came, 3 days later, we were ready. The resistance was fierce, and the enemy losses were devastating. Rodriguez, who was still recovering from a shoulder wound, coordinated the positioning of our artillery with deadly precision. "Just like old times in Normandy, Hank," he joked as he adjusted the firing coordinates. The winter continued relentlessly, but our fighting spirit only increased. Stories of bravery multiplied in every sector. Young Parker, who had arrived so nervous, was now respected for his courage. Doc Miller continued to perform miracles with limited supplies, sometimes using melted snow to clean wounds when drinking water was scarce. One evening, as we shared a meager meal in our foxhole, Martinez told me about his family in New Mexico. "You know, Sarge, when this is all over, I want you to meet my mom. She makes the best chili you've ever tasted." It was these moments of humanity that kept us sane in the midst of the chaos. The weeks dragged on, and each day seemed like an eternity. But our determination never wavered. Our general's nuts response had become more than a word, it was a symbol of our unwavering resistance. The sound of Patton's tanks breaking the siege is something I'll never forget. But it was those dark days, when we were alone and surrounded, that truly defined who we were. Every man who fought in Bastogne carries with him not only the memories of cold and fear, but also of the extraordinary human spirit that kept us united and determined in the face of the impossible. With the arrival of Patton's troops, we might have thought our troubles were over, But the war was far from over. The easing of the siege brought new challenges and responsibilities. Our unit was assigned to perimeter clearing and consolidation operations, a task as dangerous as the defense of Bastogne itself. The Germans may be retreating, but they're still as lethal as wounded snakes. I warned my team during a briefing. Martinez agreed, reminding us of what had happened to an Allied patrol that had let its guard down prematurely. Rodriguez, still recovering, insisted on returning to active service. "I didn't come all this way to sit around while you guys did all the work," he said, adjusting his bandaged arm. Doc Miller protested, but he knew Rodriguez's determination too well to argue much. Parker, who had proven himself in recent weeks, was now leading his own squad. Watching him grow from a frightened rookie to a competent leader was one of the few satisfactions we found in the midst of the chaos. He had learned the most important lesson well, to keep his men alive. One particularly foggy morning, we received information about a group of isolated German soldiers still holding out on a nearby farm. Our mission was clear: neutralize the threat or accept their surrender. Preferably the second option. We had seen enough death. "Keep your eyes open," I instructed as we approached the farm. "They may be desperate, and desperate soldiers are unpredictable." Martinez followed close behind, his radio ready to call for support if necessary. The dense fog made visibility precarious, but years of combat had sharpened our senses. We detected movement in the barn, at least a dozen German soldiers. To our surprise, we found not only combatants, but also wounded and some very young, practically teenagers. The German sergeant commanding the group approached with his hands raised. His eyes showed the same exhaustion we saw in our own. "Meine Männer sind müde. Wir wollen aufgeben." "My men are tired. We want to surrender," he said in German. Martinez, who understood some of the language from working with German prisoners, translated. It was a surreal moment. Those same men who days before had tried to kill us were now under our protection. War has its ironies. We organized the transport of the prisoners, ensuring that the wounded received medical attention. Doc Miller, always a professional, treated everyone with the same dedication he gave to our own. "A patient is a patient," he always said, no matter what uniform he wears. During the operation, we found diaries and personal letters from the German soldiers. They were painful reminders that, under the different uniforms, we were all human with families, dreams, and fears. One particular letter from a young soldier to his mother particularly struck me. He spoke of his fear of dying far from home and his wish for the war to end soon. The following weeks were dedicated to strengthening our positions and supporting the Allied advance. The winter was still harsh, but now we had adequate supplies and proper winter gear. Seeing our men in dry boots and warm clothes was almost a luxury after so long in the cold. Parker continued to impress with his leadership. During one particularly tense sweep, his squad found and disarmed several traps left by the retreating Germans, saving countless lives. "I learned from the best, Sarge," he said with a smile, referring to the long hours we spent discussing tactics and strategy. Rodriguez, even with his arm still not fully recovered, proved invaluable in coordinating with Patton's units. His knowledge of the terrain and enemy positions helped plan operations that minimized our casualties. One evening, sitting with Martinez in our observation post, we reflected on everything we had been through. "You know, Sarge," he said, "when we get back home, no one will really understand what we've lived through here." He was right. Some experiences are impossible to share completely with anyone who hasn't lived them. The end of the siege of Bastogne marked a turning point not only in the battle, but in our lives. Each of us left there different, older in spirit, if not in years. Innocence had been replaced by a profound understanding of the cost of war and the value of human life. The lessons learned at Bastogne about leadership, courage, comradeship, and sacrifice shaped not only the rest of our participation in the war, but our entire existence afterwards. Every decision I've made since has been influenced in some way by those freezing days in Belgium. With the siege broken and the Battle of the Bulge drawing to a close, our experiences in Bastogne began to turn into memories, some heroic, others too painful to share. But it was what happened over the next few days that really solidified our understanding of the significance of that battle. One morning, While supervising the reorganization of our position, I received an unexpected visit. An officer from the High Command wanted our unit for a special mission to locate and rescue American soldiers who had become isolated during the confusion of the battle. "You know this territory better than anyone," said the officer. "And more importantly, you know how to survive in it." Martinez and Rodriguez immediately volunteered for the mission. Parker, now a respected leader, also joined the team. We split up into small groups, meticulously scouring the areas where reports indicated the possible presence of lost soldiers. The terrain that had once been the scene of fierce battles was now silent, marked only by the traces of war-destroyed vehicles, abandoned trenches, and occasional darker reminders of the human cost of the conflict. It was during one of these searches that we found something extraordinary. In a small wood, we discovered a group of 5 American soldiers who had survived for weeks hiding from the Germans. They had been separated from their unit during the first days of the offensive and, unable to return to the Allied lines, had created a small underground hideout. "We never gave up hope," said their leader, Sergeant called Collins. "We heard the sounds of battle and knew you were still fighting." Their resilience and ingenuity were impressive. They had developed elaborate systems to collect water from the snow and even managed to steal supplies from German convoys. As we escorted them back, Martinez remarked something that stuck in my memory. "See, Sarge, war isn't just about big battles. Sometimes it's about small acts of courage that no one will ever know about." Rodriguez, even with his injury still recovering, was instrumental in coordinating the search and rescue efforts. His experience in night navigation and knowledge of the terrain saved lives. "Every soldier we find," he used to say, "is a family that won't get bad news." The stories we heard from those we rescued were true testaments to the human spirit. One young corporal had kept a detailed diary of his survival, which would later become a valuable document about the battle. Another soldier had risked his life to save a Belgian family who had sheltered him. Parker, leading his own search party, showed a maturity that made me proud. "I've learned that leadership isn't about giving orders," he told me one evening. "It's about keeping your men alive and doing the right thing, even when no one is looking." As January progressed, our rescue mission grew into something bigger. We weren't just finding lost soldiers, we were collecting stories, preserving memories, ensuring that Bastogne's sacrifice would never be forgotten. Doc Miller, tireless as ever, treated not only the physical wounds, but also the invisible scars of battle. "Sometimes," he confided to me, "the wounds we can't see are the ones that take the longest to heal." One of the last operations we led was the recovery of the bodies of fallen soldiers. It was grim work, but necessary. Every dog tag found men of family could have closure. Martinez kept meticulous records of each name, treating the task with a reverence that moved me deeply. Now, so many years later, I realized that Bastogne wasn't just a battle, it was a test of human character. I saw ordinary men become heroes, frightened young men become leaders, and I learned that true strength lies not just in resisting the enemy, but in maintaining our humanity even in the most inhuman circumstances. When we finally left Bastogne, we carried with us more than memories of combat. We carried lessons about courage, sacrifice, and the true meaning of brotherhood. Martinez, Rodriguez, Parker, Doc Miller, each one of them, living or dead, has become part of who I am. Today, at 97, when people ask me about the war, I don't just talk about the battles. I talk about the men I met, the lives we touched, the stories that need to be preserved. Because in the end, it's not about victory or defeat, it's about the people who make history happen, one brave choice at a time. The snow in Bastogne may have melted long ago, but the lessons we learned there are still as crystal clear as they were in those freezing days of 1944. And as long as there is someone to tell those stories, the spirit of the Screaming Eagles and everyone who fought in that part of Belgium will live on.